Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we're graced by the enigmatic master of the narrative shadows. Where memory and mystery collide, Greg Rhyno, a literary craftsman whose words don't just tell stories, well, they haunt them. With his debut novel, To Me You Seem Giant, Greg didn't just write a story. He etched a timeless echo of adolescence and friendship, casting it against the nostalgic, rough-edged backdrop of 1990s Thunder Bay. A novel of hard-won wisdom, it swept into the hearts of readers and garnered nominations for both the Writ Lit Award and the Alberta Book Publishing Award, securing Greg a place as a compelling Canadian voice in a contemporary literature. Now, Greg has a voice that is at once hauntingly nostalgic and fiercely present. But he's not just a novelist. He's a creator who has left his mark on the pages of Hobart, Brittle Fence, and Prism International. Now, in his short stories, Puppy Teeth to Shithawks, What the Place Was, and Autonomy, Greg captures the uncanny essence of moments and places often overlooked, characters and histories that slip through the cracks, and emotions that linger like ghostly echoes. Now, his words have traveled through the quiet corridors of some of Canada's most respected journals, leaving traces of his unique blend of grit and grace. But wait, there's more. His latest project, Who by Fire, invites us into a world where mystery is layered upon mystery. This book introduces Dame Poera, turned recluse detective, whose journey through arson, intrigue, and her own complex past will thrill and haunt readers alike. Now, with the launch of this mystery series, Greg blends his gritty, character-driven storytelling with a detective keen eye, drawing us into the underbelly of Toronto's heritage buildings and the secrets they hold. As a writer, musician, teacher, and storyteller, he's a man of many talents. Yet his greatest magic may be the way he transforms stories into something you don't just read, but feel. Greg leads us into the literary world where each line in the lyric is a breadcrumb guiding us into the unique universe. So please join me in welcoming Greg Rhyno. Greg, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. That was a spectacular introduction. I'm sorry my dog is possibly barking all the way through it, but yeah, she might be hanging out with us as we talk, so I hope that's okay.
That's perfect. Get her up on the couch, put her in the camera, not a problem.
Yeah.
Didn't hear anything on my end.
All right, awesome. Okay.
I want to dive into it with you here. We're going to go right back in time. What inspired you to write To Me You Seem Giant?
Um, well, I mean, I that is going back a few years. So I kind of have a very pat answer to that I say sometimes, and I'd be happy to elaborate on it. But the real quick answer is, I'd been writing some short stories, and I was interested in writing, and I'd been working as a teacher and working as a musician. And when my partner and I decided to have a baby, and she got pregnant, I realized that I might only have 9 months to work on a novel, work on something bigger. And so I tried to write a novel while she was pregnant with my son Walter, but I got about halfway done, and then I finished the other half when he was a little bit older. So that was sort of how that started. I realized pretty quickly that it was easier to write in the evenings than it was to practice drums while the baby was sleeping. So that was part of it for sure. But also, I think I had a lot of sort of unresolved feelings about Thunder Bay. I've been working as a high school teacher for a number of years, and I had a lot of feelings about being a high school teacher, and I wanted to take all that and to put it into a story, and to sort of imagine. I live in Guelph. I wanted to imagine what would happen if I had stayed in my hometown of Thunder Bay, and what would that look like. So that was a chance for me to sort of work through those feelings.
It's neat that you bring up these feelings. So we're going to a lot of things I want to touch on here. So you were a drummer, and obviously we can't really lullaby our children to sleep drumming. Now,
No.
when you were a musician, was this something that you did as a hobby? Were you in a band? Were you up in Thunder Bay playing the gigs? How did that work?
Yeah, I played in a lot of bands when I was younger. One of the great things about playing in a band in Thunder Bay is there was always an interesting music scene in Thunder Bay in the 90s, but there just wasn't a ton of bands. And so we were really lucky that we got to play with a lot of bands that were coming through. In the 90s, there'd be a lot of touring bands, and a lot of times, that trip between Toronto and Winnipeg would involve a stop by in Thunder Bay. And so we a lot of times would open for these traveling bands, and so we got to open for all these really great bands. And so that was a really great experience growing up. When I was a teenager, we were playing in bars. I started playing in bars, I think, when I was 15, maybe. And we opened for bands like Thrush Hermit, The Odds, The Watchmen, all these different sort of up and coming bands in Canada. And that was pretty fantastic. And then when I moved to Southern Ontario, I got together with some people who had been in my previous band and some new folks, and we started a band called the Parkas. And we recorded 3 or 4 records. We put them out on indie record labels. We toured across Canada a few times. We got to go to Texas for South by Southwest, and they played us on CBC radio, and it was a really great experience. It was a really great time playing music. So that was something that factored into that first novel quite a bit.
Now, you had brought up the word emotions, and you had said, we were working through our emotions and arguably our relationship with Thunder Bay for To Me You Seem Giant. What specific emotions are you referring to? What was left unsaid when you left Thunder Bay and came to Southern Ontario?
Oh, I think everyone sort of has funny feelings about their hometown. Like I think it's hard to escape that. There's always a little bit of unfinished business. There's always sort of, every time I would go back, I mean, I still, have relatives who live there. I still have friends who live there. And I think you always sort of wonder, what would happen if you stayed. When I would go back, I would wonder, like, is there a life here for me? So I think that's sort of the those unresolved feelings. Like, what is it that pulls you about a place? What is the tractor beam of home that's pulling you back in, right?
It's a really cool turn of phrase there. It's the tractor beam of home that's pulling you back. It's such a neat way to say that. Now, with this book, some have said that this novel really navigates the complex friendships and turbulence of adolescence. When we look to this book, your first novel, did you really just draw on your own experiences and teenage experience, or how did you create the words and the wonderful world that is?
Yeah, so that novel's funny because it flips back and forth between two timelines. It starts in 1994 and then it flips to 2004. And so it sort of sees the main character as a high school student in 1994, and then as a new teacher teaching at his old high school in 2004. And it's set up sort of like a mixtape. So every chapter is a song, and you can flip back and forth. There's the mixtape that the character starts in 1994 and he finishes in 2004. And so it tries to balance both of those perspectives. A lot of times people will talk about it as the 1994 one as being the one in the past, and then the 2004 one as being the sort of the present timeline. But really, by the time that novel came out in 2017, 2004, it was kind of, it was in the rearview mirror at that point. So it really is sort of both stories taking place in the past. But part of the function of that story was to sort of to look at flipping back and forth between the past and a possible future, and really just try to situate the character eventually in some kind of present, right? And one of the things I've always found about music, like the main character in that story, I've always had terrible stage fright. So one thing that is good and bad about playing music is and having that sort of fear is you're just locked into the moment, right? Like you are living in that moment. You're not thinking about what you're going to have for for dinner later on, and you're not thinking about things that happened to you last week. You are just, keeping time, staying focused, listening to your pals, and trying to live in that moment. So that's sort of ultimately what that novel I think is about, is sort of learning to live in the moment.
Now, it's such a wonderful title. How did you come up with that name? What is the meaning behind that? To me, you seem giant.
It's a reference to a Sloan song called Pen Pals, which is actually it's funny. Uh, the song Pen Pals is the lyrics are taken from so the band Sloan, I guess when they signed to David Geffen Company, they had access to all this interesting stuff, and one of the things that they had access to were fan letters to Kurt Cobain. Um, and so Pen Pals is apparently a lot of the lyrics in that song are just taken right from these this fan mail to Kurt Cobain, and so it kind of made sense in that respect, because it does talk about the death of Kurt Cobain. It does talk about sort of the idea of someone growing up and leaving his rock and roll past behind a little bit. But it also talks a lot about the band Sloan, which is one of my favorite bands. And it was nice to sort of bring in that element, because there's references to that band and to other bands from the 90s in the novel. But it is also a reference to Thunder Bay, because one of Thunder Bay's most famous landmarks is the Sleeping Giant. And so it is this idea of living in a place where there's something that seems bigger than you all the time. And for the main character, that's partly the city itself, but it's also his best friend, who goes on to become this successful musician, whereas he's sort of stuck back in his hometown.
Wow. And it's neat that you said you're a drummer who had stage fright, and we got to kind of ignore all of that while we're up there with our buds playing, have a good time. I love the explanation of the title. Thank you. And let's fast forward here. Now we have Who by Fire, Dame Polera. It's a fresh face in the detective genre. What inspired you to create Dame Polera?
Again, I kind of have a bit of a pat answer for that, but I'm happy to dig into it. The inspiration was partly I work as a high school teacher, and there was a woman who I worked with who was complaining one day about having to cover for her husband after work at his job. And I said, "Oh, what does your husband do? Like, you've worked all day, and you're going to go and do something else now." And she said, "Oh, he's a private detective." And I thought, "Oh, that's fascinating." But the idea of someone who was not only a substitute private investigator, but a reluctant private investigator was really interesting to me. It's someone who doesn't really want to do this, someone who has all the skills to do it, but kind of resists it. I thought that was a person who was worth exploring as a character.
So what separates Dame from, let's say, Sherlock Holmes, Enola Holmes, or the Bletchley Circle? What makes this character better than the rest, I guess?
I don't think she is better than the rest. I don't think she would think she is either. But she's someone. Her father was the character's father was this sort of renowned private investigator, and she was kind of his sidekick growing up. And she really, as she got older, she didn't want any part of that life. She wanted to have just a normal everyday life. She wanted to work her job, and she wanted to have a family, and she wanted sort of something a little bit more steady. And so what makes her a little bit different is that she keeps getting sucked back into this job, right? It's circumstance that brings her into being a detective, rather than it is her profession, rather than she believes she's some great detective and has this ego that she has to satisfy. She's just it's going to be right now, anyways. It's going to be a 3-book series. The second one is actually called Who by Water, and it's coming out in April. And again, it is she really only wants to get involved when she has to, and I think that separates her a little bit from all the other detectives. It's not really her job. She resists it.
Now, this novel, in my opinion, weaves together themes of, like, we look at arson, heritage preservation, and personal history. How did you develop this mix of mysteries for the story?
Well, so I talked to you about the woman that I worked with, whose husband was a private investigator. I also had another friend who continues to work for, I believe it's the township of Oakville, and she was always interested in heritage and preservation, and I thought that was interesting too. I thought in terms of so. I think the detective genre is oh, here's my dog again. Hey, buddy. Like the detective novel is kind of an old form, right? Like it's a little bit of a nostalgic form. And so I wanted her in a way that's not all that much different from Pete Curtis from Museum Giant. I wanted her to be someone who's always a little bit stuck between the past and the present. I think that's something that's interesting to me, and something that I'm always sort of looking at. I sometimes feel like everyone's a little bit stuck between the past and the present, and she's always sort of navigating those things. So she has there's this pull of this very sort of nostalgic job for her. She doesn't have a lot of nostalgia about it, but it is this sort of old-fashioned job, and yet she wants to leave it behind, and her day job is to work at City Hall, trying to protect old buildings and decide which old buildings are worthy of value. And so I think that was kind of a good place for her. It's not, again, it's not totally different in a sense from Pete Curtis, who was in To Me You Seem Giant, who was actually he was a history teacher. There are people who are very interested in the past, but are always trying to navigate the past. I think one of the things that was different about Dame Polera versus the character in my first novel is that she's, I think, very suspicious of nostalgia in a way that maybe Pete Curtis is not, and maybe I was not when I wrote To Me You Seem Giant. I think growing up, I was always interested in old records and old bands and old TV shows, and I think there's a lot of that in the new novel, but I also think that I think nostalgia can be very dangerous. I think the idea of trying to make things the way they used to be is really damaging, and I wanted my new character to be smarter than that and to be more aware of that.
Now, when we look at this novel and we look at being self-aware of what's happening from everything that's coming up, and we look back in time and here we are, mystery novels often hold a mirror up to society in unexpected ways.
Mhm.
What do you believe Who by Fire reveals about the state of our society and cities today?
I don't know if I don't know if I can speak to the state of all of our cities, but I know that Toronto is historically a city that's bad at protecting its landmarks. I know that this is a novel that also sort of takes a look at gentrification. It's concerned with the way cities change. It's set in Parkdale, which is a community that's really resisted gentrification in some ways, but it still has that Queen West, $8 coffee situation all the time. So yeah, but I think the other thing that it tackles is just the way I'm just sort of I don't know, I'm not, this is such a big issue, but it does sort of talk about, the vulnerability of women. It talks about how women have to take on responsibilities that a lot of men don't. The main character in the story is someone who, she's divorced. Her landlord's trying to evict her. She has an elderly father who has had a stroke and she has to care for him. So she has these responsibilities that someone that, maybe a more hard-boiled detective, tough guy might not have, right? She's not this sort of lone wolf character who can just sort of dismiss the rest of the world and worry about herself and her case. She really has a community of people who she cares about and who she has to look after, and she has responsibilities that lone wolf might not have.
So it's neat that you bring up these responsibilities, and I'm going to put a pin there because I'm going to come back to this. But you had brought up Toronto isn't great at preserving heritage, is how I'll phrase that. And when we look at Toronto's heritage buildings and urban landscape, which play a large role in Who by Fire, what was your approach to capturing the city as a character?
I don't I It's interesting because I was born in Toronto, but I've never lived there. And so I have a funny relationship with Toronto, whereas I always feel like a bit of a tourist there, but there's something I've always found really appealing about Toronto. When I was younger, it used to frustrate me because we'd play shows there and I'd always be fighting my way down the 401 and then trying to find the bar and then dealing with sound check and a grumpy sound man. But there's the dog again. One thing I've come to realize is that there's a lot of places in Southern Ontario that don't. It's a hard thing to balance, right? Because you want to create space for people to live in that city, and you don't want to turn all of these beautiful things into monuments that just slowly crumble. But it's at the same time you want to acknowledge the good things about the past and the beautiful architecture that existed there, and not just turn it into steel and glass and something without any memory whatsoever. Of the city as a character, I guess the real quick answer to that is I was really interested in the character of Parkdale. I don't actually. It's a funny thing. I don't name it in Who by Fire, and I wanted to sort of give it a little bit of a mystery and make it a place that seems like it could be many different places in many different stories. But I was interested in Parkdale. My dad lived in Parkdale when he was younger. I would hear stories that he would tell me about growing up there. And or at least spending, not growing up there, but spending some time there. It just seemed like the best fit for this. I was doing my MFA, my Master of Fine Arts, when I was writing this novel, and it was one of my fiction profs, Russell Smith, suggested that Parkdale would be a good fit. We had spent some time there. It was during the college teacher strike, so all the MFA instructors had to find different places for us to have classes because we couldn't do it. I went to University of Guelph, which was housed at Humber, which was a college, so that place wasn't available to us. And so we were meeting in all these different places, these community centers and libraries, and we met a bunch of times in the basement of the Parkdale Library. And so we'd spend some time hanging out there. And he suggested that would be a good fit for a detective novel, just because it is a place that resists gentrification, because there's so many different kinds of people who live there. There's so many different cultures that live there, and it's just a really vibrant place. So the more time I spent there, the more I thought it was a good fit, and I would go back and do a little bit of research and wander around, and it just seemed like that was the right place for Dame, not only to actively do some detecting, but also I felt like that's where she came from. So that's where I housed it, I guess.
So I want to circle back to something that we put a pin in earlier when we talk about Dame and we talk about these expectations and responsibilities and this mental load of aging parents and trying to be there, things that, as you said, a grumpy old detective might not necessarily have to deal with.
Yeah.
How big of a factor does that play into Dame as a character and her personality and her wants and her emotions throughout the story?
I think it's really her primary motivation is one of the main things about Dame as a character is that she doesn't want to be a detective. Like she wants to take care of her family. She really wants to have what I think a lot of people would consider to be an average family. She divorced from her partner a few years before the story starts, or rather, a year before the story starts, I should say. And one of the things that's happening in the story is she's actively trying to conceive a child, because she sees that as like that's who she wants to be.
Mhm.
She wants to be a mother. She's lost her mother growing up. Her father's getting older. She has friends and she has a job, but she wants to create a community for herself, and she wants to create a family for herself. And that is far more important to her than the other things that are happening, than the cases that she's being offered. But she sees that as a way of achieving those things, right? Ultimately, the way the story starts is that her landlord tries to evict her, and she overhears her landlord talking to this relatively sketchy private detective on the phone, and she knows the man that her landlord is speaking to. His name's Anton Felsky, and when she brings this up, the landlord wants to know, like, why do you know this guy? And she said, well, my dad was a famous detective, and the landlord, who is in the process of firing Anton Felsky, wants to know if her dad would take on this case. And she knows very well that her father's not capable of it, but she thinks maybe she could do it herself. And maybe if she did it, she would be able to stay where she's living and continue to have a little bit more normalcy in her life.
And Greg, where can people learn more about you?
I'm all over the internet. I think, I have a website, gregryno.com. I'm on Instagram. I might be on X for a little bit longer, but we'll see how that goes. It's getting a little scary out there. And I'm on Facebook, but I'm not all that hard to find. I'm represented by the Rights Factory. That's my agency. And Who by Fire is coming out on Cormorant Books.
And you said the next installment, Who by Water, is coming out in April.
Yes, yeah. So I should correct myself and say that Who by Fire is out on Cormorant, and Who by Water will be coming out in April on Cormorant as well.
Now, Greg, if someone had said to you or said to someone close to you, what's something that scares Greg Rhyno the most? What would you say?
Oh, we talked about it a little bit already. I mean, this is terrifying to a certain degree, right? Any kind of it's funny. I mean, my most jobs I've had have been talking in front of other people. I'm, a high school teacher. That's what pays my bills. I worked for years as a musician, and now as a writer, I find myself in situations all the time where I have to speak in front of other people, and for whatever reason, that is something that I've never really gotten over. I feel relatively comfortable with the anxiety that comes with it. I think I've learned that it's nothing that you ever really get rid of. I thought maybe I'd just shake it off eventually, but you just sort of learn that this is sort of a funny thing that's sitting on your shoulder while you're doing a job like this. Um, but yeah, I think that is my strange little fear that follows me around. I would say stage fright. See the man with the stage fright right here.
And Greg, when you're sitting down to write your next novel, short story, prepping for school, what type of coffee or tea do you usually drink?
Well, I drink coffee the same way my dad drank coffee, which is coffee with 2 cream, no sugar. Um, But I have to admit, I'm fighting off a cold right now. So I am drinking tea with honey right now, which is, I think, keeping me from hacking all the way through this conversation. But I have to say that coffee is one of my very favorite drugs. It is, I know some people are always trying to get off coffee. They always talk about drinking too much coffee, but generally speaking, I have a really good relationship with coffee. I don't find coffee really wakes me up, but what coffee does for me is it makes me feel weirdly optimistic. And I think that that's a pretty good thing for a relatively safe drug to do. It feels like the day is kind of manageable once I've had a cup or two of that stuff.
Hey, Greg, I have time for one last question for you today, and thank you so much for your time on Coffee with Chris. Is what makes Greg Rhyno smile?
Honestly, sometimes in the morning, a cup of coffee isn't too bad, you know. But if I'm gonna give a more sincere answer than that, I love my family, I love my kids, I love my partner, and I even love my dog, even when she interrupts my conversations with you.
Amazing. And as I said, it was the last question I had for you today on Coffee with Chris. Everyone out there, get to Greg Rhyno on the Google machine, on the internet, find him, get a copy of Who by Fire, Who by Water coming out in April of 2025. Greg, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Remember, everyone, to smile to inspire and have yourselves a fantastic day.